So, welcome to my end of the year book haul of all the books I've read this year. 2023 has been a wild year, and I have read so many books. So, last year I read 17. This year I've read 30. I'm going to say 29 really, because currently I'm reading the 30th book, and I knew that I wasn't going to finish the 30th before the end of the year. But I will get to what the 30th book is at the very end of this video. So let's get into the books that I've read this year. The first book I read was Wonder. This is by Palacio. I forget what the guy's first name is. I think it's, yes, R.J. Palacio. Wonder is a very popular book about a little boy named Augie who has a disability. He has a facial deformity, and this book I actually found out about when I was probably 16 or 17. I was in high school, and I was watching two little girls, and their mom was reading the book Wonder to them every single night, a chapter. And so she was like, if you want to read it to them, go ahead and read it. And so we started reading this book together. And then when I got a little bit older, I was like, you know what? I want to reread this story and really figure out what this story was about. And at that time, my second time reading it, this year was my third time reading it. My second time reading it, I hadn't been diagnosed with my chronic illness yet, and so rereading it for the third time really hit me emotionally, of like having to go through the ideas and mindset of being now chronically ill and like having similar representations and similar experiences and thoughts that Augie was. So I felt like the author, which I thought it was a guy, sorry. I feel like the author of Wonder didn't honestly do that great of a job explaining what it's like to live with a disability. And also I feel like the way that she came about writing this story was kind of really messed up. She saw somebody in a store, a young kid with a facial deformity, and decided to write a book on it, not knowing really their experience or having somebody in your life that you can get that information from. Like, if you're going to write a book on something that you've never experienced, you really should have somebody in your life that is kind of guiding you through what it's like to live that life and have those experiences firsthand. So as much as I love the storyline and I think Augie has a lot of good representation, I just don't think the author described it very accurately. But I do really recommend this book. But at the same time, I'm like, just talk to people within the disability community and see what their opinions are, or talk to other people that have these forms of disabilities or deformities, and speak to them and see what their opinion is. The second book I read this year was John Green, An Abundance of Catherines. This book, although John Green is my absolute favorite author, this is my least favorite book by him. And that might be really weird to hear, but the reason why it's my least favorite book is because it's super analytical and super logical and very mathematical, and I do not understand any of the math in this book. It takes away from me finding enjoyment in the characters because I can't find connection in the characters, because I'm like, I don't know what they're talking about. It's also not a book that I normally would be interested in. It's not like for my favorite genre. It's not something that I really find absolute enjoyment in and get excited to read. However, the second half of this book really sells the book. Like, some book series that you read are really like that, where the first half is like but the second half sells you on the book, where you're like, oh, I actually really do like this. It's just the first half really had me sitting there being like, I don't really like this. So that's my opinion on John Green, An Abundance of Catherines. I still love John Green. I will always, always, always go back to his books and read his books. Actually, I'm going to be doing a read with me video of all the John Green books that I have sometime in the 2024 year. Pillow Thoughts 1. I read this, I think, for the first time a couple years ago, but I decided to reread it again this year. It is a super good poetry book. I loved it. I highly, highly, highly recommend Pillow Thoughts 1. I actually got Pillow Thoughts 5 for Christmas this year, but the only downfall is I got Pillow Thoughts 4 for Christmas this year. The only downfall is I don't have Pillow Thoughts 3. So I'm not going to be reading that one for a while. But I'd love to do, like I said, a read with me video on this whole poetry series because these books are so good. So after I read Pillow Thoughts 1, I actually read Pillow Thoughts 2. I really thoroughly enjoyed Pillow Thoughts 2. Both the books have similar, the second one has similar context to the first one, but they have also different genres of thoughts and ideas. The fifth book that I read this year was The Sun and Her Flowers by Rupi Kaur. And Rupi Kaur is an artist and author that I believe originates in Toronto, Ontario, which is where I'm originally from. And The Sun and Her Flowers, I think, will always be one of my all-time favorite poetry books, just because of the sunflowers and the ideas and the ideologies that are in this book. I do think that it's still very beautiful and has a lot of relation of just being a woman in itself. I feel like poetry books in general are books that I would recommend to people that are just starting out reading or just want to explore reading and what it has for you or what it can offer for you, because poetry in general is something that really you can take your own meaning from. It's not something that you have to super connect with those characters. It's just something that you can fall in love with. Okay, same author as the last one, but this one is Milk and Honey. Once again, like I said, I really, really, really love this author. She is so talented. She's so amazing at what she does. But Milk and Honey is completely different than The Sun and Her Flowers, and you get completely different vibes from this book. I am so sorry for any background noise that's going on. I highly recommend this one because it is so freaking good. I also just love her illustrations that she does in her poetry. I don't know if she writes any other genres besides poetry, but love, love, love those books. So I Find You in the Darkness. This is another poetry book that I read by Alpha, and this one was really, really good. But honestly, I also feel like going back to the whole context of like you really just find your own relation to poetry books. It's really hard to dislike poetry. It's very hard to find a poetry book where you're like, I really don't like this. I really thoroughly enjoyed that poetry book. After that was Turtles All the Way Down, but I actually gifted that book away because I got a whole new collection of John Green books for Christmas last year. So I gave that one away after reading it sometime around the middle of this year. So what I want to say about Turtles All the Way Down is this. Turtles All the Way Down is also a John Green novel, and I want to say it's a good book and it's one of my all-time favorites. Looking for Alaska was my top favorite, and then I feel like it was Paper Towns, but then Turtles All the Way Down slid right in there under Looking for Alaska, and it became my second favorite novel by John Green. And then Looking for Alaska, Turtles All the Way Down, Paper Towns, The Fault in Our Stars, and then Will Grayson. And then after that, it is An Abundance of Catherines, because that's the only books that I have read by John Green so far. After Turtles All the Way Down, I read Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl. This novel does not really have a storyline. There's a storyline and an idea of a story, but not a really good storyline to follow where you're like, oh, this is what happens, then this is what happens, and this is what happens. I liked the book, but I honestly would not pick up the book and read it again. So this is one of the books that I will be getting rid of at the end of this year and passing it on to somebody else, and hopefully they can find a lot more enjoyment in it than I did. You Are a Badass by Jen Sincero. This one became a favorite for me this year. I highlighted so many things in this book and made so many notes. It was ridiculous. This is everything I could want and more from a self-help book. This book had a lot of good info. I loved how the author introduced every single chapter and how at the end of each chapter she related it back to the context of the chapter. I knew a lot of the info already that was in this book, but honestly, it's always good to have a refresher. It's always good to hear it from a different point of view or a different perspective, and also to just sometimes be reminded, like, hey, this info exists. Use it, apply it to your life, because honestly, every single day is just trying and applying things to your life to see how it can work and how you can be your best version of yourself and how you can be the happiest. I just honestly really highly recommend this book. Like, I just fell in love with this book, honestly, this year. The Girls with No Names. I'm pretty sure we have probably all seen this book at some point or another in our library. I know, being a little girl in like elementary school, I've seen this book so many times in my library and thought it was like a thriller, and I wanted to pick it up and read it, but I honestly really struggled with reading when I was younger, and so I just never picked up like chapter books like this ever. This book, oddly, is split into parts, so there's like book 1, book 2, and book 3 within this book. I don't know if it is supposed to be like 3 separate books and then they just combine them all together to make it one big book, because I know some authors do that. That was a weird way of saying that, but I know some authors have done that in the past where they have taken all 3 of a book series and combined it into one book so it's easier. But this is the first book that I have read that is like this. So this book was really hard for me to get into at first because I was just really confused. The time was like, I believe in the 50s or 60s, the time frame, and it was just a story that was really slow. But the young girl, one of the main characters, she has a chronic illness, and it has to do with her lungs and her heart, I believe. I read this like near the beginning of the year, so mind you, I don't remember a lot about it, but I felt like I started to really relate with the book when I heard about that part, and then I really got interested. There's a lot of twists and turns and crazy things that happen in this book that drew me right in, and by the end of it, I fell in love, and I was like, wow, I would read this again, or I would highly recommend this to somebody of an older audience just because I feel like it's so interesting. But I feel like at the ending, it really depicted something of love and happiness, and that's what fully made me fall in love with it, because it's very rare that characters who go through so much struggle, or people that go through so much struggle, they can find happiness or find love or peace. So the next book I read was Pieces of Her by Karen Slaughter, and this book I really thought I was going to enjoy because, as you can see, it has a little Netflix symbol. I watched the series. It's like a mini series on Netflix. I watched the mini series on Netflix before I even got the book. I honestly didn't even know that there was a book for this mini series that was on Netflix. I didn't even connect that the two were the same thing at first, but I did do a read with me video on this book at the beginning of the summer, I believe. And so if you want to go see that, go and click on it on my channel. It's somewhere over in there, or I have a little playlist of read with me videos. But I did a whole read with me and I commented on each and every chapter. This book is insane. There was a lot of parts about this book that I loved and enjoyed, and there was a lot of parts about this book that left me deeply confused and not really able to follow along with the story because it was very, very confusing. But overall, I would say that I really liked the book, but I just wouldn't read it again because I honestly don't feel like there was something that I could take away from the story from reading it a second time around. I think that it's a good thriller mystery book if you really want to depict it as that, but at the same time, I read another thriller mystery book this year that I liked a lot more than this one. And yeah, but I would recommend this to older audiences if they were really interested in reading it. And I think somebody could find enjoyment from this book. It just was personally not really for me. The book I read after Pieces of Her was Twisted. This book is really, really graphic and has a lot of context of essay, family abuse, violence. The whole point of this book is kind of like, no matter what you go through, you get to choose your reality and get to choose your outcome for life. And I love the idea of that, but I just feel like the book poorly executed that. I feel like it did not properly give that representation when I've read other books this year that have had that same context and narrative and gave way better representation of that. So personally for me, didn't love it. I liked it. I wouldn't read it again. Wouldn't necessarily really recommend it unless you're into really, really dark themes and kind of like sadistic humor almost. But it just really turned me off from the whole idea of the main character. I'm not into like super violent humor or like humor that's super harmful and suggestive. Like, it just really turns me off from the idea of like wanting to be around that person or like be in their energy. And like reading a book with a main character that's like that just makes them very dislikable for me. And so like if I can't connect, then I'm just sitting there being like, ugh, like I don't want to read this because I don't like you. And that's kind of how reading is, which sounds weird, but it's like those characters you kind of have to connect with in some way or form. And so if you can't connect with the characters, you're almost sitting there being like, you know, very uncomfortable, very disinterested by what is happening. The next book I read was A Stolen Life by J.C. Dugard. This is a nonfiction book. This was the first nonfiction book that I had read this year. The way that I found out about this book was actually from the true crime community on YouTube, and I had heard about her from a true crime video. I'm not sure who the true crime channel was, but I know it was one of them. It was either Kendall Ray or Danielle something. I forget what her last name is, but I usually watch one of those two or like a couple other female channels that speak about true crime. I do highly recommend this book, and I'm not going to give it a rating. It's a true story. It's very inspirational. It's super informative. It has a lot of context and tools about predators and how to recognize abusive behavior and bad people. However, this is definitely for like kids 13 and up, like into adulthood. The way that JC goes about telling her story And that's another book that I read this year, where somebody that goes through immense amount of turmoil but has such utter strength to keep going and pushing and succeeding and fighting against the odds, without waver, without, you know, an ounce of doubt in their mind that they can do this, is like, just, there's something so powerful about that. There's something so motivating about that. And truly, I feel like as human beings, we all need that sometimes. We all need somebody in our corner being like, it's okay, you can do this, you're going to succeed, no matter what you think or feel about yourself or what's going on in that moment. Sometimes we just need to hear somebody else's stories of they went through this. Whether it's similar to our own experience or not, but just like, I went through this and I made it through. That's just, sometimes I need to hear that too. And so I feel like I've read a lot of books with that narrative this year, where it's really, really motivated me to just take life and be like, it is what it is in this moment, but I know I will make it through this. I know I will continue to do the best I can. I know that without a doubt in my mind, I will succeed at whatever I want, and whatever is meant for me will make my life better and propel me forward, and whatever is not meant for me will... Sorry guys, I ran out of storage. I don't know where I left off last and what I was saying exactly, but not to compare situations at all, but life is hard. Life is hard, and a lot of times it's amazing and good, but it also has a lot of difficulty and struggles and a lot of things that just absolutely fucking suck about it. And so reading books like that, I feel like, just gives me so much more inspiration to like keep pushing through and keep trying, even when, you know, it gets hard, or when I'm exhausted and I have difficulty like seeing the good parts, I feel like, because we all kind of go through that, you know. The next books I read, which I read it in this order, and I also did read with me videos on these books, but I read the Hunger Games series. Okay, so I read the Hunger Games series. The first book I read was The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Look how pretty that cover looks. Oh, it's upside down. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Suzanne Collins is an excellent writer and author, and she is one of my favorite authors of all time. When I read The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes this year, I did not realize how much I was going to fall in love with it, and how much of a different perspective I was going to get on the Hunger Games series. Not just a different perspective, but how much I would fall in love with this book more than the Hunger Games series itself. And for me, Peeta and Katniss will always have a special place in my heart, although Finnick Odair is my favorite character in those books, in the movie too. I fell in love with Lucy Gray for an entirely different reason than I fell in love with Katniss. And I want to say that these books are something that every single person needs to experience, because it brings something to this world that otherwise we would not know, nor would we have that experience if you don't read it. Suzanne Collins writes about life in a way that... Suzanne Collins writes about fictional realism in a way that most people will never ever experience unless they read a book by her. The Hunger Games, I read this next. I didn't take too much away from this book that I didn't take away the first time. I feel like it was relatively the exact same as reading the Hunger Games the very first time I read it. It is a great storyline. It has so many twists and turns. It keeps you captivated. It keeps you interested in the storyline. There's not very much that I can say about the book that isn't already known. Even the movies, I feel like when I hear people be like, oh, I've never watched them, I'm like, what? I still myself haven't watched The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and I need to watch it, and I will watch it. I will devour that movie up, because the storyline, oh my gosh, I'm praying that they kept it relatively the same, because the Hunger Games movies are a little bit different than the books, but they're still mostly the same. Catching Fire, same thing. Amazing storyline, very interesting, keeps you captivated. This is when Finnick makes his first debut, and he just chef kiss like he was made by the gods himself. I'm being a little dramatic, but like, if you love Finnick, you get it. If you don't, then you don't. Mockingjay, honestly, I was kind of bored reading this at the beginning. It's a lot more political than the rest of the books, but I think it's all relatively important. I think every single book in the Hunger Games kind of offers something different. Hunger Games itself offers this naivety, innocence, purity. Catching Fire offers this rebellion of fighting back and doing what's best for yourself. And this book really does offer the fictional realism of war and propaganda and fighting for something that you love despite your own life. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes offers love and power. The dynamic of, is power more important? Is money more important? Is love more important? And I feel like that's a constant struggle in our society, especially right now, is that people are choosing money over love, or they're choosing love over money, because that is just something that's very, very prevalent in our society right now, unfortunately. But that's the case. A lot of people are having to choose to give up the things they've always dreamed of having because they can't afford it. So the next book I read was The Book of Happy. This is another self-help book. It is very good. Highly recommend it. It's one of those books that, like, you read once and then you give it away, pass it on to somebody else so they can enjoy it just as much as you did. But I made multiple little footnotes, so I hope the next person that reads it can, you know, find a little bit of enjoyment in the things that I wrote between the lines. But like I said, The Book of Happy is just another self-help book. It wasn't exceptionally captivating or anything, or super eye-opening, but it's one of those books where you're just like, thank you for telling me that, thank you for showing me that. The next book I read was Stephen King, It. This book I absolutely hated.
Who are you talking
I was not talking to anyone. I was recording a video, you see.
Oh.
I didn't like this one though.
No?
No.
You said you liked it.
It?
Yeah.
No. It was so bad for him. It was the worst book I read this year.
Really?
Here, let's pause this. Okay, so I left for a little bit and then I took a shower, came back. So I'm sorry for the random outfit change and appearance in the middle of this video, but I had to take a shower. So we're talking about Stephen King's It. This book is probably the worst book that I read this year. I have nothing against Stephen King. Like, honestly, he's a great director, and all of his movies or short films or anything that he's taken a part in directing or filming, I have loved and thoroughly enjoyed. And as of the original Stephen King It movies, they're good for the time frame that they were filmed in. And the newer It movies I love. I have really, really enjoyed them, and I really hope he actually makes more and just continues on the storyline. I know it ends how the book ends, but actually the newer movies are nothing like this book at all. I found this book to be kind of uncomfortable. Like, the N-word is dropped so many times, like so frequently, it just makes me really uncomfortable reading it, or even just like having the idea and context of that there's young kids that are like having these conversations. It also just has a lot of weird situations that happen in it that were just very uncomfortable to read. So that's one of the reasons I disliked it, but also it's really long and the chapters are super long. I found it kind of confusing. It's very wordy. I felt like I was reading the same sentence over and over again. And if it didn't feel like I was reading the same sentence over and over again, it felt like it was over explained and just too many words to explain something in fewer words. Like, it could have been explained in fewer words. So that's one of the reasons why I didn't like it as well. And I would say, honestly, like, I didn't even read this book. I listened to it on an audiobook, which still counts as reading. It's just, I read like half of it. It took me 3 years in total to read. And that was me putting the book down, like reading parts of it, putting it down, picking it back up, reading parts of it. And then finally I was like, I'm not doing this. I'm just going to listen to it on an audiobook. And even listening to it on an audiobook was so like tumultuous. So I recommend this for people that are like huge Stephen King like enthusiasts. I actually got a Stephen King novel for Christmas again, and like after reading this I was like, I'm never reading another Stephen King novel absolutely ever again after reading this one. And sure enough, I got a Stephen King novel for Christmas. I am excited to read it though. I feel like even with books that I dislike, I am such a follow through and like fully to the end follow through type of girl. So I'm still kind of excited to read it, even though I absolutely hated that one. Like, and I think that's the only book that I have ever read where I like thoroughly disliked it. Like disliked it. All right, so I actually have watched this whole entire series from beginning to end, and I watched it before I read the book, and I've watched that series every single time since. And I did a little November reading vlog type of video, so go check that out. But it involved this book, and I had read this book while watching the first season because the book only kind of depicts the first season. It's very good, super accurate to the show. The show's super accurate to the book. I don't know if Jay Asher adapted this book to fit this Netflix series afterwards, so I don't know if this is like a newer edition, new copy of this book, or if he just left it the same and then they just really did an amazing job on the book or on the TV show. I think it is the second option that I just gave you guys, of that Jay Asher and the directors of 13 Reasons Why, and I think Selena Gomez was a director on that show, did just a very amazing job of capturing the book. The book does have a couple differences than the TV show, but it still has all the same context. I think the TV show is just a lot more graphic. It has a lot more stuff that happened in it. I definitely recommend that book to older audiences as well as the TV show if you want to go and watch it. But that TV show is amazing. I would say after the second season though, it takes like a weird twist. Still very similar storyline, but it's just different. So then I read 2 a.m. Thoughts. Honestly, I thought it was going to be a lot different than it was. I thought it was going to go like all the way up to 2 a.m. and then stop, but it doesn't. It goes past 2 a.m. But there was a lot of little poems that I highlighted in here. Let me find one and I'll read it. I just flipped to a random page as you guys saw. This one is 7:34 p.m. 2 a.m. Thoughts. One day, you too will have stopped searching strangers' eyes for companionship. You won't lie in a cold bed with nothing but dark thoughts to warm you. You will not order a pizza for yourself in an empty apartment. One day, you will have found your person, the one human being on this earth designed for you, the one that eases the pain in your heart and reminds you of why you are here, why none of your other relationships worked, why you had to go through heartache after heartache, and you will be thankful for all the pain because it now has brought so much happiness. You will look into your lover's eyes and feel something none of the others have made you feel. You will look into their eyes and realize they are the only ones you want to look into for the rest of your life. You will no longer feel alone. Yeah, so this was the first book that I ever read by Mackenzie Campbell, but I really, really, really enjoyed it. It was super good. She's a very talented poet. It just wasn't what I expected from the title. However, there was a lot of really good poems in there, and I felt like I connected to a lot of them, especially the one I just read. I was like, chef's kiss. That was really, really, really sweet and cute. So, The Book of Awesome, I originally read this when I was in 6th or 7th grade. I think it was 7th grade. Anyways, I did also a video on this book, I believe in the same video as I did 13 Reasons Why, and I think 2 a.m. Thoughts was in that same video too. The Book of Awesome is just kind of like a collection of short stories about things that the author believes to be awesome. I kind of skim read this one. This is the only book that I've really sat there and skim read beside Stephen King's It. And the reason why I skim read it was because a lot of the stories are more geared towards younger audiences. They're not really things that I feel like as adults we sit back and think about and are like, this is so awesome. In my head, what I think is awesome is like being peaceful, being happy, having family around me, celebrating with friends, spending time with friends. You know, just like those things are what is awesome to me now, or what really move me and bring emotions and feelings to the surface. Like, I don't really sit back at the end of the night and I'm like, it's so awesome to lay in my comfy bed. Like, I mean, sometimes, of course I do, but like, I'm not really thinking that in depth into it. I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm so thankful to lay down and go to sleep or whatever, which I think just happens as you get older. You just get a little bit over it. You're like, huh, I'm just ready to be in bed right now. So I did really enjoy this, but I think, like, honestly, and I don't mean this in a wrong way, but I think men and children would more so enjoy this book than a woman would. And the reason why is just because the humor, the context of the stories is more geared towards men humor than female. And I think the audience, it just would more so connect with those audiences rather than adult females. Not saying that adult women can't have more manly humor or like stuff like that, because I feel like I kind of do in a sense, in a way, but not really. It's just, I think men would think it's more funny than what a woman would. It's just, I don't know. That's my opinion, at least. It was still a good book. It's just not a book that I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to read it, or that I really care to read again. However, these books, her volume 1 and her volume 2, these poetry books are written by a man, and it is such the trope of like men written by women. If you've ever heard of that, or if you haven't heard of that, if you haven't heard of it, go and search it up now. Go search it up and come back to this video. If you have heard of it, you know what I mean. You know the men written by women, and you know how much we cherish those men. So, oh my gosh, Pierre Alex Jante. He is everything that a man written by a woman is, okay? I didn't realize at first that, because I saw the books and I saw that they were super popular, and so I believe I asked for them for Christmas, and I got both of them at the same time. That would be in last year's like Christmas haul. So both these books, I believe I got at the same time. And I didn't really realize that Pierre, obviously it's a man's name. I didn't for some reason connect it in my head that these are books written about women from a man's perspective, but by a man written by women. So it's not the casual, I feel like, when men compliment women, usually it's talking about how sexy you are, or your body, or your appearance. And that's not always the case. Obviously, men also compliment women on their intelligence and their mind and those things as well. But I feel like 90% of the time when it comes to compliments from men, it's usually about your looks or your appearance. And that's amazing. We appreciate that so much because I think everyone needs to hear those words. But sometimes we want to know how cherished we are, how much we are cared about, how much we bring happiness and joy to your life, or just being appreciated in a different context just besides the obvious. And being a woman, I feel like sometimes our assets are kind of overlooked because, like, as a woman, you just have those, or you just are. So these books give off the vibe, to me at least, of the Little Woman quote. Just because my dreams are not the same as yours doesn't mean they're unimportant. And the reason why it gives me those vibes is because of the way that these poems are written. So I feel like it's only necessary for me to read a highlighted poem from each. I know I highlighted pages in here. So her one, oh, that's right. I highlighted it with yellow, so it's super hard to see the little yellow indentations. Anyways, this one's highlighted. Your love blooming, an exceptional woman, growing roots in a field of women who aspire to be bad girls and heartless savages. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no beauty in living life numbly and holding hands with misery. Therefore, continue being both the sun and the moon. And I love this. The reason why I loved this poem so much is that your is written as you are. Love blooming. You are love blooming, an exceptional woman, growing roots. You are rooted within yourself. You are rooted within the things around you, in a field of women who aspire to be. So you are just among these women aspiring to be bad girls and heartless savages. And I think that every single man and woman out there has this, or has experienced wanting to be heartless, but not being able to be heartless. There's nothing wrong with that, though. There's nothing wrong with not being able to be heartless and not having a heart, because you love so deeply and you feel so passionately. There's nothing wrong about being so loving and so passionate and having all these emotions and feelings. There's no beauty in living life numbly, which is meaning, like, there's nothing beautiful about being numb to the world and being heartless and being a savage and being a bad girl, quote unquote. But you know what is beautiful is living your life and experiencing day to day and having those emotions flow in and out of you freely. Because holding hands with misery, like keeping those feelings within yourself, or being heartless, or being heartless is misery. Being sad and angry is misery. Meanwhile, feeling those emotions, expressing them, that is love. That is passion. That is the epitome of being human. So Therefore, continue being both the sun and the moon, because both the sun and the moon hold beauty, and yet they are vastly different from each other. Her too, once again, it's also just as beautiful. This is another highlighted page, I believe. I can barely see it. But this one says, I'm a man. I cannot tell you what burden she carries, but I can tell you that they are too heavy for one person to carry. That one is fine and dandy. I feel like all these poems are beautifully food for thought. You don't need to sleep with her to know what she is, the woman of your dreams. Know that. You don't need to sleep with her to know that she is the woman of your dreams. I think all of these are really like about self-love and self-realization and loving yourself and allowing other people to love you, and also kind of like a note to men of being like, it's okay to love women and express it in a way that's not only just like sexual gratification. I think that I'm going to speak for a second freely, but also I don't want it to come off as judgmental or in a wrong way. But I think that because men are raised in this society where women are very sexualized, and women are raised in a society where we are very sexualized, our main points of getting gratification or feeling loved or being appreciated sometimes stems from our physical representation rather than us just being humans and being beautiful as we are and deserving to be loved just simply because we are humans. I think that sometimes men feel like if they try to love in a different way, then it's almost viewed as being like wimpy or like not. It's like when men are called like simps for like treating women right or just respecting women. Like, that's not being a simp, that's just called basic human respect, essentially, is what I'm trying to like say, is that loving women properly and seeing women not only just for sexual gratification or their appearance, but seeing them fully as good, bad, beautiful, ugly, everything that a human is and could be, and just accepting it, and despite those bad things, loving them anyways, and with those good things, you know, really, really appreciating a person fully, undeniably. I think that, you know, sometimes men are looked at as being wimpy for being and feeling that way, and they really shouldn't, because like that's what majority of women want. It's also just the right thing to do. It's just basic fucking human compassion and kindness. So that's one of the reasons why I love these poetry books so much, is because they show that aspect and perspective of men being that type of way. It's like how every single man in romance novels or TV shows that are romantic kind of act towards the women. And that's why I feel like that's also so romanticized in a way, is that women have this fictionalized idea of how a man should be and how he should act, but in reality, like, we also have to have the same view for men, that they are not perfect and that they have good in them and bad in them and all of that, because we're human freaking beings and we're imperfect. But if you want to love someone, you have to love them despite the bad within them and despite everything that may happen. It's just kind of reminding me of the Taylor Swift lyric, I don't want no other shade of blue but you. And Taylor Swift said that represents like I don't want to go through any other amount of sadness with anyone else. I don't want to experience any other hurt besides the hurt I could experience with you. Or if you look at The Fault in Our Stars, Augustus Waters and Hazel Grace, Hazel says to Augustus Waters, I don't want to hurt you. And Augustus says, it would be a pleasure to be hurt by you. It's like you can't avoid hurt within this world, but you kind of get to choose in this lifetime what you allow and what you disallow and what you are going to accept and what you're not going to accept. And I think there's something beautiful within that. But kind of being hurt or going through sadness or going through turmoil or hardship is inevitable, but it so much so makes us appreciate the good. And also I feel like it makes you value the things around you a lot more, because it's very easy to take for granted the things that you have in life. And I think as human beings, we're kind of conditioned to take for granted things we have and also constantly be looking for something else. But like, I don't know, it just teaches you to value the things that you have in life. This is the next book I read, which this is a non-fiction book. I always get fiction and non-fiction confused. I have a lot of thoughts on it. This is the first like science book I have ever read. And I love, love, love it so much. Henrietta Lacks. I had heard her name before, didn't really know who she was or what her story was. But as soon as I read this book and I had the perspective of her family, her daughters, her sons, her cousins, her husband, everyone, I was enamored. I was mesmerized by her story. She is the definition of our science, of our scientific research that is happening today, of every single cure to a disease, every single scientific phenomenon that has happened to develop vaccines. Just literally our medical industry is built on this woman. Without her, we would not have the medical advances that we do today, which is insane. Back when Henrietta Lacks was alive, there was no HIPAA laws. There was no laws in place to protect Black individuals or really individuals from the hospital doing what they wanted with your body and with your cells. And so this was during a time when like sundown towns were still a thing, as well as like segregation was very prevalent still in the society. So Black individuals didn't have a lot of rights, if that makes sense. And Henrietta Lacks came from a family that wasn't very well educated on medical anything, as well as they were kind of grew up very rural, so they didn't really have the same access to education as white individuals did. As well as not just that, but I will say this, like, this is a pretty well known fact, I would assume, but I'm going to say this. So because of slavery, Black individuals weren't able to receive education for a lot longer of amount of time than people that were white. So because of that, Black people systemically were not as educated as white people on their body or on science or on any form of education that we receive now. And I'm saying this as somebody that's biracial and whose family was literal slaves. our family was led over through the Underground Railroad with Harriet Tubman. So I'm very well versed on certain things regarding slavery and segregation, and my grandparents grew up during segregation. So, and my grandfather grew up during segregation in the South Mississippi. So I kind of have roughly some ideas here and there of certain contexts of what that looked like. But also, I just feel like this is common knowledge, and if you didn't know this, now you do, but you could also just do your own research and figure it out. But because of that, and because of times and how different it was back then, her family didn't know a lot about how cells worked and how her body and cells went on to live and create all of these medical advances. But the saddest part is that they weren't given permission to do these things. The family never got compensation. Therefore, her family is well known, but not very well known. And her story is out there, but not really out there. And her family's never received compensation, or Henrietta has never received compensation for helping create these medical advances. So it's a very, very interesting story. But like I said, it's based on someone's actual life and real experiences and her family's experiences. So at the same time, it's very, very disheartening and really sad. I found myself at the very end literally tearing up because I was like, wow, this woman went through so much and she lived such a short life. But it really showed me this perspective of community where the death of a parent will always affect a child so deeply, but you just never, unless you experience, you just are never really aware how deeply that affects you, or could affect somebody. I'm trying to be sensitive with my words because I have never experienced this myself. But you can see how deeply her family was affected by their mom's passing and their cousin's passing, and mother, sister, child, wife, like that family member passing away, how deeply her family was affected by that. Because some of her kids were young, very young when she passed, and well into their adulthoods, this death, but also this phenomenon of her cells creating all these things have so deeply impacted their lives. So that book really, really gave me a different perspective on life and death, and it just gave me a lot of like theological thoughts. I think that's the right word. Not just like theological, but also just like thoughts about life and death and how that affects us without us even really realizing or knowing. The next book I read was Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. This book, I actually watched the movie first before I read the book. I had the book for a very long time and I was like holding off watching the movie. I was like, no, I'm not going to watch the movie until I've read the book through. And then I was like, you know what? I really want to watch the movie. It looks really good. So I ended up watching the movie, and then I would say about 4 or 5 months after I watched the movie, I read the book. And the book is just as good as the movie, if not even better. But I would say they're just about the same, because this movie I could watch 1,000,000 times over. And I don't feel that way about very many movies where I'm like, I could watch this over and over and over again and never get bored of it. And every single time I watch it, I'm like finding new things or falling in love with it more and more. This book is the peak of thriller, crime. Love it so much. The author is an amazing storyteller. The storyline itself is so freaking good. And the person that plays Kaya, I think that's what her name is, Kaya. She's so freaking cute in the movie. Like they did such a good job casting and like figuring out who should play this kid. The whole storyline in itself is so freaking good. I loved it. I cannot wait for like people to watch that movie and also read that book because I highly, highly, highly recommend it. Even the ending is just, oh my gosh, like you could never expect any of the things that happen in those books, but I highly recommend it. Okay, Life as We Knew It by Suzanne Beth. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. I'm not even going to try. So these books were given to me by my mom, but she got recommended them by one of her staff. So they were like, hey, I'm reading this book. My mom asked if it was good because she knows I read a lot of books. I've read 30 books this year, guys. So she knew that I had a strong interest in books, and so she was like, is it good? And the girl said, yeah, it's a really good book series. So my mom ended up buying it for me, and that was very sweet of her. So I read the first book, Life as We Knew It, and I liked the story a lot. It's not a book that I would read again though, because it's just very slow. And there's a lot of things about this book that I dislike. So the storyline is very repetitive in this book. And I didn't find it like over the top interesting. I was like, oh, this is a good story. You know, like it's something that I'd be like, oh, it's good. But it's not great. It's not amazing. It's not something that I was like, I love it. I need this in my life. It's good. Other thing is, I didn't feel like it was like overtly like so interesting storyline. Like I'm like, oh my gosh, like what's happening next? I didn't feel myself feeling that way. I kind of just was like, oh, this is mundane. It's going through day by day and like what's happening. And this is supposed to be like a sci-fi, like dystopian future sci-fi type of thriller book, and I just didn't really even get those vibes from it. I just kind of got the vibes of it being like, this is an event that happened and now we're literally living life and trying to get by day. And so I also didn't like read reviews on this or even watch videos on this book, so I didn't know what it was going to be like or what was going to happen. So that was the first book. And then the second book was not even a continuation of the first book, which is what I thought it was going to be. So this is called The Dead and Gone by Suzanne Beth. And I thought it was going to be a continuation of the first book, and then I was super confused why the characters were different. This storyline was a lot more interesting and a lot more like twists and turns and different things like that, where I was like, wow, okay, this is really interesting. But then at the same time, I found myself extremely bored at parts where I was like, oh my gosh, and had a hard time getting into the book. So I'm like, I was just kind of like, whatever. And I also just didn't understand why we weren't going to get a continuation of the first story. I was like, why am I reading about all these other characters, new people? Like, it did not make sense to me. I was not that interested because it's not a continuation. And then I really liked the ending of it, but like once again, I was just kind of like, it's whatever. And then I read this one, which is the third one, and I have one more after this one. And now I'm finally understanding why it was two different storylines to begin with, because the storylines connect. And that makes a lot more sense, but same with this book. I'm having a very hard time getting through it. I'm about halfway through it now, so I know that I'll probably end it maybe by the end of this year. But if not, I've read about 29 books this year / 30 books this year, and I can't wait for next year to come and for me to read even more, because I feel like that's just everything. But yeah, I really hope you guys enjoyed this little book haul of all the books I've read this year, and I will see you guys in my next video.